So today we're going to hear from author Ari Berman. Ari is the National Voting Rights Correspondent for Mother Jones and a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. He's the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, and Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Rolling Stone, and he's a frequent commentator on MSNBC and NPR. Today, he's going to be sharing with us his new book, Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. Ari will be joined in conversation today by Ty Rushing. Ty is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Iowa School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and he's the former chief political correspondent for Iowa Starting Line and co-founder of the Iowa Association of Black Journalists. So will you please help me welcome Ari Berman and Ty Rushing.
All righty. Okay, mic is working. Excellent. All right, so Ari, you ready?
For us tall people.
I know. I'm like, get up a little bit. Okay, so Ari, in America, we kind of generally like to think of ourselves as having a model government that gives people true and fair representation.
Yes.
However, you make the case that not only is this not true, but it was never true, and that the framers of the Constitution, who were all wealthy white guys, did this intentionally.
Yeah.
Could you break this down for us?
You summarized it well. Well, first off, I'm really happy to be back in Iowa. I grew up in Fairfield. I have a lot of fond memories of being here. I actually got my start as a journalist in Iowa City because before my senior year in high school, we wanted to start a school newspaper and we didn't have one. So I went to journalism camp at the University of Iowa, and I was a little intimidated because I was with a lot of kids that had school newspapers and we had no idea what I was doing. I went with another friend, and I basically spent a lot of sleepless nights for the week, subsisted on pancheros. And at the end of the week, we produced a mock newspaper, and we won Best Newspaper Design and Best Feature Article. And I realized maybe I can do this journalism thing. And so that's kind of how my career in journalism got started. So it's great to be back home, particularly on such a nice day, which you can't always take for granted in Iowa. Back to the question. So I had been covering voting rights as a journalist for about a decade, and I covered restrictions on voting. And after a while, I began to ask myself, what's the purpose of doing this? Is it just to try to win an election, or is there a larger project at work? And I realized that the larger project at work was minority rule, that a faction of the country didn't want to have a majority of support, but they wanted to wield a majority of power, which seemed very much at odds with the idea of democracy being based on the consent of the governed. And certainly with Trump, what I wanted to be able to tell the story of was that Trump wasn't just an accelerant to the democratic crisis we're facing. He was also a product of a broken democratic system. So I went back in my research, and the first thing I did was I read the constitutional debates, which I had never done before because they're quite dry and quite long. But the thing that you realize when you look at how the Constitution was set up was that the founders themselves, which are always portrayed as these kind of geniuses in white wigs, right? Now they're rapping because of Hamilton. They realized that they were a very specific minority in the country. They were white male property owners, as you said, a bunch of rich white guys. Many of them were also slaveholders. And they wanted to protect their interests first and foremost. They wanted to protect the interests of this powerful white male minority, meaning that they wanted to exclude poor whites, women, African Americans, Native Americans, other people who were not them from the governing institutions at the time. And so they had this very idealistic rhetoric about democracy. But when it came time to say, should we let the people elect the president? No, let's not do that. Should we elect the people elect the Senate? No, let's not do that. Should the people have a say in who the Supreme Court is? No, we don't want to do that. So they basically, if you look at the original Constitution, the public could only elect the House of Representatives. So only one branch of the government was directly elected by the people. And if you look at those debates, there were these very powerful minority factions that were able to get more power. For example, in the House, slave states said, well, we're outnumbered by free states. So they said, okay, let's come up with a 3/5 clause. Let's treat enslaved people as 3/5 of a person only for purposes of representation, right? We're not going to give them 3/5 the rights, but we're going to count them, so the slave states are going to get more power in the House. When it came to the Senate, The small states say, we want the same amount of power as the large states. And the large states said, that's crazy. And the small states said, well, if you don't give us the same amount of power, we're going to join France, which is about the worst thing you could say in 1787. And so then each state gets the same level of senators, regardless of population, which gives the small states more power. So in all of those ways, despite the idealistic rhetoric of democracy, America was a lot less democratic than a lot of us are led to believe in terms of how we're taught about democracy in school.
Oh, wow. Well, he's teaching us today. Okay, so now you start the book by outlining how former Republican presidential candidate Pat Buchanan was a proto-Trump.
Yeah.
Buchanan warned that white Americans become a minority by 2050. He wanted to build the Buchanan fence at the U.S. southern border, and he even labeled undocumented migrants as being part of an invasion. Does this all sound familiar? So why do you think Trump was able to better capitalize on, the rhetoric that Buchanan was spilling to get himself to the White House?
So one of the things I talk about in the book is there's this anti-democratic foundation that's built into American politics. But there's also all of these newer anti-democratic tactics that are layered onto it, like voter suppression, gerrymandering, the stacking of the courts. And if you look at what's motivating this reactionary movement, so much of it is about the changing demographics of the country. And I would argue that is one of the things that's motivating it right here in Iowa, where the demographics are changing what has been a very, very white state for very many, many years. And basically what happens is, and the reason why I start my book with Pat Buchanan is, he's sort of thought of as this fringe forgotten figure. But the 1990 census is the first census to predict that white people will one day be a minority in the country. And Buchanan basically starts saying, this poses an existential crisis for the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is a largely white party. And he says that if the Republicans don't do something about these changing demographics, then they will become extinct. And the backstory here is that there's this remarkable 15-month span in the 1960s where the Civil Rights Act is passed in July of 1964. The Voting Rights Act is passed in August of 1965. And the Immigration Reform Act is passed in October of 1965. And this changes the whole way American democracy works, because so many people that were formerly enslaved, formerly marginalized, are given new rights and brought into American democracy. And also the demographics of the country start changing, because America had very restrictive voting laws and also very restrictive immigration laws, and those are struck down. So new people are entering the country, new people are given rights, and that starts putting America on a path to a majority-minority country. Now, a lot of people welcome these changes. They believe that America is better for its diversity, better for being a multiracial democracy, but some people clearly don't, right? And so what Buchanan says he wants to do is he says he wants to make what he calls David Duke. David Duke is a former Klan member and Louisiana state representative. And he said he wants to make David Duke mainstream. He wants to take that white supremacist ideology and make it mainstream. When Trump is thinking about how to run for office, he realizes that there is a voter base out there that is anti-immigration, they're anti-free trade, they don't like the Republican Party along with the Democratic Party, and there's this opening to court what Buchanan called the emerging white minority. So in the same way that Buchanan takes David Duke and makes it mainstream, Trump takes Buchananism, which is quite angry, quite reactionary, and he gives it the apprentice makeover, right? He's basically doing Buchananism, but on a golden escalator. And that appeals to a lot of people a lot of them are racist, a lot of them are anti-immigration, but they also feel left out and disillusioned with the American political system. And that gives Trump an opening to take this America First platform that was basically written out of the Republican Party. And he starts to transform not just the Republican Party, but American politics by doing it.
Now, this is interesting because, I think you hit the nail on the head, but why do you think so many mainstream journalists just kind of ignored that a big factor for Trumpism and the direction the Republican Party is changing demographics in the country?
Yeah, because they're just afraid of saying it. They're afraid of that they're going to impugn people as racist or anti-immigrant, but it was clear to me that that was what was motivating so many people to support Trump. And that's not to say that everyone who supports Trump is a racist or everyone who identifies or votes for him is, but if you look, for example, at what is motivating that movement, I talk about at the end of the book, I talk about, there's a really interesting study about who the January 6th insurrectionists were. And again, this is the most extreme part of the Trump movement, but it obviously is a very influential part of the Trump movement. And the fascinating thing is the insurrectionists aren't who you think they are. They don't come from the reddest parts of the country. They don't come from the most rural parts of the country. The best predicator of whether someone was an insurrectionist is they come from counties with the biggest changes in the demographics. Places like Harris County and Houston, which have changed a lot. And when they asked people what they believed, it wasn't just they were from places where the demographics were changing. They said that they believed that white America was under siege. And so people said it was about a stolen election. It wasn't about a stolen election. It was about an America they felt like was being stolen from them by new people coming in and new people exercising democratic rights. And Trump wasn't very subtle about this, because remember, where did he say there was fraud going on? Detroit, Milwaukee, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Atlanta. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what all these places have in common, right? And so I think the way I think about it is, what I say in the book is it's like trying to create a fortress to stop what is the coming siege. This is going to happen whether we like it or not, right? But the fact is, can they forestall the day when these changing demographics actually lead to changes in politics?
Wow. Okay, so in chapter 2, you outlined how Wisconsin went from a purplish swing state that kind of prided itself on common sense government. Sound familiar again? To not only a Republican stronghold under former Governor Scott Walker, but essentially a petri dish for right-wing legislation and restricting practices that could be redistricting practices that could be replicated across the country.
Yeah.
So one example, Walker's legislation that defanged public sector unions was replicated here in Iowa, and under the Branstad administration. So, well, why was Wisconsin the perfect place to launch this strategy, and why do you think other states soon replicated the Wisconsin model?
Yeah, it's very relevant to Iowa. Well, I think what happened was that after Barack Obama's election in 2008, the Republicans made the states their counteroffensive, because that was the first place they could take back power. And what happened is they won these massive majorities all across the country. It happened a little bit later in Iowa than in other places, because in Iowa the state assembly flipped, but the state senate didn't flip till 2016. But in a lot of places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, the state legislatures flipped in 2010. And then it was also a redistricting year, meaning they could draw new maps based on those massively inflated majorities, and they could lock them in for the next decade or more. And so what they did is they not just gerrymandered, but they tried to change the whole complexion of state politics. And Wisconsin was really notable because it was a state that was known for good governance, as you said. It was a place that was known as a laboratory for democracy. It gave rise to things like collective bargaining rights for unions and unemployment insurance and Social Security and things like that. And they figured, if we can do this in a 50-50 state, if we can go after unions in a 50-50 state, if we can do voter suppression in a 50-50 state, if we can do gerrymandering in a 50-50 state, then that's something we can replicate all across the country. And that's what you saw, that previously in Wisconsin, both Republicans and Democrats upheld democratic norms. And they would argue about issues, but it wasn't like they were trying to make it so that the other side no longer existed. And politics became a lot more radical, a lot more authoritarian, a lot more aggressive, and that changed the dynamics. It changed the dynamics in Iowa. I mean, my entire childhood, I think, Terry Branstad, I think, was governor pretty much my entire childhood, at least it felt like it. But I mean, he was a guy that got along with the Democrats. And you had one Democratic senator and one Republican senator, and they got along. And you had an extremely moderate Republican in Jim Leach, who represented this area forever, and he got along with Republicans and Democrats. And then those people started becoming purged from the party. When Branstad reemerges, he is no longer the Terry Branstad. He still had the mustache, but he was no longer the Terry Branstad of the 1990s. He was the Terry Branstad that elevated Kim Reynolds. And you no longer had Tom Harkin. You had Joni Ernst, right? And then you no longer had Chet Culver or Chet Culver's son, right? You had different kind of people running the legislature. You had the Steve Kings of Iowa, who were always marginalized in the Republican Party. They started to take over the state. And when they took over the Republican Party, they took over the state. And the same thing happened in Wisconsin and other places. Now, In some places, the pendulum has shifted back, right? In Wisconsin, they have elected lots of Democrats. They have struck down those gerrymandered maps. I was just there yesterday. There's going to be competitive elections for the state legislature. Iowa's kind of behind Wisconsin in that fact, but the fact is, these Midwestern states that were known for moderation, that people were not just nice people, but they had nicer politics. The politics there have become a lot more like the politics of a place like Texas or a place like Florida in terms of how people operate, where you don't just have political agreements, but you see your opponents as something representing an existential threat.
Oh, wow. And so, you know, we're talking about Wisconsin right now. In Chapter 8, you kind of take us back to Wisconsin, and you talked about how Democrats, like, you know, they elected Tony Evers in 2018, how they got back, they regained control, but because of the gerrymandering, like, the Republicans still had immense power in the legislature and they wielded. But how were Democrats able to kind of claw back and, like, you know, return some sort of semblance to normal for Wisconsin?
So what happens in 2018 in Wisconsin is the voters, they elect Tony Evers to replace Scott Walker. And Scott Walker is kind of the national face before Donald Trump of this more radicalized GOP. And I argue that it was really the radicalization of the Republican Party at the state level that paved the way for Trump. Because if they hadn't already radicalized against democracy, they would not have been so open to a Trump-like figure in the beginning, who so clearly was willing to upend Democratic norms. So Wisconsin elects a Democratic governor, and the Republican legislature that year, and this is really incredible, they get 46% of votes statewide, the Republican candidates for the Wisconsin Assembly, which is their state house. But they get 64% of seats in the state legislature, which is basically impossible to do. And the first thing they do after the Wisconsin elects a Democratic governor, they hold a lame duck session right before Christmas, and they strip the governor of power. And I recently interviewed the Democratic governor of Wisconsin, Tony Evers, who is just like such a Wisconsinite. He loves polka, and he has an extremely dry sense of humor. And he uses words like, I'm so jazzed up, but like with a total monotone, like I'm so jazzed up. But he said to him, that was a predictor of January 6th, because it was a soft coup. It wasn't a violent coup. But it was saying when someone else wins, their victories are illegitimate. That had never happened in Wisconsin before. The idea that, like in past administrations, someone loses, you say, okay, we respect the will of the voters, let's try harder next time. And that changed, and it changed at the state level, and then it changed with Trump. And now we're just saying, like, okay, one election ends November 5th and another battle begins. Like, that's not normal. It's not a normal thing that when the votes count, a whole nother battle begins. That's supposed to be the end of the process. The votes are counted, we move on. And now I fear that these post-election skirmishes are just part of our political language because of how much democracy has been radicalized.
Yeah. Well, now you talked about growing up here in Iowa, and you know, our politics are very much like Wisconsin's politics a decade ago.
Yeah.
You know, Republicans controlled the governor's mansion, they controlled the Iowa House, the Iowa Senate, all 4 congressional seats, both
Yeah.
Senate seats, and
Crazy.
every statewide office except for the state auditor. And what they did when they didn't control that seat was they passed legislation in the previous session to limit that person's power, and they attempted to do so again this session. So obviously this Iowa is very different from the one that you grew up
Yeah.
in, but like Wisconsin, there is a way to go forward. Like,
Yeah.
do you see that happening here, or do you think we're kind of stuck in this red state?
No, I think, I mean, so I didn't really answer, I realized, your question, which was how did Democrats get it back? And so what Democrats did in Wisconsin is, yes, they made sure that it went for a Democratic presidential candidate, but more importantly, they started working at the state and local level. First, to rebuild the Democratic Party. A good friend of mine, Ben Wickler, moved back to Wisconsin from Washington, D.C. to run the local Democratic Party. Usually the local Democratic Party was run by kind of like political hacks, political lifers, and he was like, I want to change the Democratic Party. I want it to be a younger, more progressive, more grassroots party. And so that started changing things. And then they started electing different kinds of people, not just to offices that you would think about, but to offices that people hadn't thought about. So for example, they started electing progressive judges to the state Supreme Court, because judges are elected in Wisconsin. And it wasn't just one election. They had to elect 4 progressive women to the Wisconsin Supreme Court to get a majority then that would strike down the gerrymandered maps so there would be fair maps in Wisconsin. So it wasn't just one election cycle. It was literally 1, 2, 3, 4 election cycles. That takes a lot of vision to have, and that's what Republicans always do. They're always focused on the long game. The takeover of Wisconsin in Iowa did not happen in one cycle. It happened over a long period of time. I think in Iowa, it started in the church, personally, and then it extended to politics, because I think the Christian right has taken over the politics of this state in a way that it was always marginalized. But I think, I saw a New York Times story about Iowa recently, and it said something like, Democrats compete in deep red Iowa. I'm thinking, deep red Iowa? Like, is it Mississippi? And then you look at the numbers. But I mean, the fact is, Iowa has 2 competitive congressional seats right now. And so the control of the U.S. House, which everyone believes is incredibly tight, could actually happen in Iowa. And one of those races was decided by 6 votes. I guarantee you I know 7 people that did not vote in that election who could have swung that race. I think they may have thought their vote didn't matter. Maybe they didn't like national politics, but I guarantee you 7 of those people were very unhappy with what the House is doing right now. And I bet I could convince 7 people that they don't want Mike Johnson to be in charge of counting electoral college votes on January 2025. So I think in Iowa, it's going to start at the state level, at the grassroots level, and then it's going to have to get back to trying to win some of those higher profile races. And it's also going to need, the Democratic Party is going to need to shift, and they're going to need to elevate more people like Tim Walz that can talk to rural America and can talk to people, because, I mean, listen, I live in New York now, so I'm part of the problem, but a lot of people in Iowa feel like New York and California controls the Democratic Party, and there's not a lot of role for people. And so Democrats have to be talking about things like the consolidation of farming, right? The death of small farming, the death of small town newspapers that has led to increased radicalization on social media. I mean, Democrats have to speak to the issues that people care about. You can't come in with an agenda that's developed in New York City and try to pitch it to people in rural America. Which isn't to say that people in rural America don't want the same thing as people in urban America. I think a lot of them do. But I think for too long, you put the camo hat on 2 weeks before the campaign, but you don't live that kind of lifestyle. And so I think that they need to elevate more people like Tim Walz in places like Iowa who won't compromise their values, but will be able to speak to people on their level and listen. Because I did an event recently with Stacey Abrams in Texas. And Texas is a very, very low turnout state. They have very, very restrictive voting laws. And a lot of people feel like their vote doesn't matter. And there were a lot of young people at the event that we did together, which is also somewhat unusual. And they came up and they asked Stacey, what do we say to people to get them to vote? And she said, you have to listen to their concerns and meet them where they are. You can't lecture them into voting. You have to understand what they care about and connect it to the things that are affecting their lives. And that's what Democrats have to do in places like Iowa to start to rebuild their brand.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a total pivot here. Stop the Steal.
Yeah.
You have dedicated chapters about the Stop the Steal movement, but bits of it are scattered throughout the book as well. So one, I guess, how close was this group to successfully overturning the results of the 2020 election? And the second part of that is, what are some ramifications that we continue to see today from this movement and all this, all the damage it's done to the trust in our electoral system?
Yeah. I mean, closer than we think, I think, was one of the takeaways from 2020. If you look at Wisconsin, for example, the Wisconsin Supreme Court voted 4-3 with one Republican swing justice voting with the Democrats not to throw out 200,000 votes only in Madison and Milwaukee, the 2 most Democratic counties in the state. So we were 1 vote away from the results being thrown out in Wisconsin and having a legitimate constitutional crisis. So closer than we think. And the thing is, Trump leaned on everybody. And he just kind of went down the list of who he could lean on. He started leaning on the county boards of elections. Then he moved on to the statewide officials. Then he moved on to the state legislatures. Then he moved on to the governors. Then he moved on to his own vice president. And instead of being held accountable for any of this, he was basically given a get out of jail free card by the Supreme Court, which said he has the power of a king, and by his own voters, who chose to feel like he was trying some heroic struggle for democracy as to doing something that should disqualify him from forever being able to run again. And now, of course, he's on the verge of somehow assuming power once again, despite his effort to overthrow power. But I think what's really concerning about the Stop the Steal movement is it's now morphed into the election denier movement, which is now morphed into taking over county and statewide election apparatuses all across the country. So the people that believe the election was stolen, they're working as poll workers now. They're working in election officials. In places like Georgia, they've taken over the state board of elections. And the more moderate, the more reasonable Republicans, in a lot of places, they have been purged from these positions. So it makes me nervous in terms of what those people might do. I don't think they're going to succeed again, but it makes me nervous to have people in positions of power that can spread a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Another ramification of it is that when they failed to overturn the election, the first thing they did was they turned around and changed the voting laws in all of these key states, including in Iowa. And we got a video of Heritage Action for America, which is a sister group of the Heritage Foundation, which is the group behind Project 2025, basically bragging behind closed doors that they did this all in secret. And the first state they referenced was Iowa. They said now they were exaggerating, it turned out, but the whole effort began in Iowa to change the voting laws in Iowa. And they weren't as successful as they could have been, but I mean, Iowa had very, very good voting laws, and in some cases still does. But it's harder to vote by mail now. If election officials do things like send mail ballot applications to voters who don't request them, they could be prosecuted. Imagine election officials being prosecuted for trying to encourage a voter turnout. Things like that are happening in Iowa, which is a state that is controlled by Republicans, but where they don't really have to fear Democrats winning a lot of these races, but they're still doing it, and a state that had prided itself, along with places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, for high voter turnout. So the laws have changed, who's in charge of elections have changed, and that's the biggest difference since I started doing this. When I started doing this, I was worried about voter suppression on the front end, and now we have voter suppression on the back end as well. And I think people should feel like their votes will count, but I also think that we have to be prepared for what's coming and not be kind of caught off guard, because I think what happened last time is a lot of people kind of laughed about it. Like, oh, haha, like Trump's not gonna leave office. And that's, okay, he's actually not gonna leave office. So like, the only good news is that we should be prepared for what's coming in 2024.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So in light of the fallout from the 2020 election, how nervous should people be about the 2024 election?
Well, it's close. So, I mean, I think, again, like people have to feel like their votes actually matter. Like, elections were decided by 6 votes in this state. And that has to be something that mobilizes people. And this is what I always tell people, there's always some race that matters. So it's unlikely Kamala Harris is going to win Iowa, although polls have shown it's closer than you might think. But the fact is, Iowa could decide control of the U.S. House. New York, where I live, it is going to go blue, obviously. But the county I live in has 2 swing districts. So New York could also decide control of the House. So there's always something that matters. And I think basically that's the message to get across. And even, I was in Wisconsin. And of course, in Wisconsin, all of the attention is on the presidential race. And then secondarily, there's a competitive U.S. Senate race. There's competitive U.S. House races. But one of the interesting things is in Wisconsin, the gerrymandered maps have been struck down. So there's competitive elections for the state assembly. And that means that a lot more people have votes that matter, because instead of there being no toss-up districts, there's 15 toss-up districts, meaning that you can recruit better candidates. Those candidates can knock on doors, right? They can talk to their neighbors. I was with a guy in Sheboygan, the brat capital of Wisconsin. I was having brat fall in Wisconsin. This guy was school superintendent for 20 years. Everybody knows him, right? So he's got a big bushy mustache. On his campaign literature, he has the Packer schedule on the back. And he can go to someone's door and have a conversation about Kamala Harris that is different than a canvasser coming from LA to have a conversation about Kamala Harris. So that's why local politics really matters. And I think first off, I think that's the best part of politics, is your neighbors and the people that are respecting the community getting involved. That's who it should be. But also, that's a way to break through a lot of the partisan noise and a lot of the things that you see on Facebook or a lot of the things that you see on Fox News or MSNBC, if that's what you watch. And to realize that, like, people have shared interests, right? A lot of people want the same kind of things. And that's one reason why I wanted to write my book, is you look at things like expanding healthcare or reasonable gun control or women's right to choose. Majorities of Americans support these kind of things. It's not that we're so divided, it's that we don't have enough political outlets to support the views of the majority. And so that's one of the things that I hope can change, and I think that starts at the state level and trickles up, as opposed to starting at the top and trickling down.
Now, it's not a part of the book, but you mentioned Project 2025.
Yeah.
And so I covered politics for a long time, so I'm kind of like a Project 2025 hipster. I knew about it before it was mainstream. But could you kind of give the folks a primer on it?
Sure. So, I mean, basically, what is it, like 800 pages? I mean, I thought one of the best parts of the Democratic Convention was when they brought the actual book out and people could see it. But, I mean, it's basically 900 pages of how to weaponize the government. And I think one of the things that happened in the first Trump term is Trump got a lot done, but he also didn't get a lot done. Meaning that the thing they were most organized was changing the courts. And they were very successful at doing it. And they also gave tax cuts to the rich. But he didn't build the wall. He didn't block people. He blocked some people from certain places, but immigration did not end under his presidency. They did not repeal Obamacare. Trump got in his own way a lot just by being an idiot. And I would argue that if Mike Pence had been president, it would have been less of a threat to democracy, but they would have gotten more bad things done because Pence would have understood how to work the system, kind of like people like Scott Walker have understood how to work the system. So basically, the Heritage Foundation is like, Trump's an idiot, but we have a plan to exploit him. He is a useful idiot for us. And we have a plan to put people at every level of government to weaponize these previously nonpartisan institutions. And one of the things that Trump did is he took institutions like the post office, like the census, that had just existed to help people, and he radicalized them, and he transformed them, and he put partisan people there, and he tried to defund them and change their mission from helping everybody to helping only him and his supporters. And basically that's what he wants to do for his entire government. And I have to say, like, when Democrats started talking about Project 2025, I'm like, this is so abstract. Like, this is never gonna work. And everyone says like Democrats are bad at politics, but like they were good at this Project 2025 thing. Like now, if Project 2025 has an 8% approval rating, and Trump's like, I don't know, I have nothing to do with it. Of course, like it's all written by people that served in his administration. So I'm pretty sure he knows what he's doing. But I think it just goes to show you that, and this is a constant frustration of mine, we don't elect one person as president. We elect an entire administration. We elected 234 judges by virtue of having Trump be president. If you look at his appointments to the federal courts, people that serve for life with very little, if no, accountability on what they could do, although we can talk about that because I think there are some things that we can do about that. But the fact is, and that's still one of these things that I don't think a lot of people understand. Right now, the presidential race, tell me if you disagree, it's still being covered as a personality contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And it's not a personality contest, it's thousands and thousands of people that they bring with them. And I think, by and large, Kamala Harris wants to appoint competent people to run the government. You might not agree with their point of view, but I think by and large she wants to bring competent people to run the government. Donald Trump wants to bring incompetent, crazy people to run the government. And I don't know why that is not breaking through more, because I think the Project 2025 stuff is broken through, but the whole ramifications of what a president does is still something that I don't think a lot of Americans understand.
They don't. I could just tell you that from a lot of interviews. All right, so on a more optimistic note, in epilogue of your book, you talk about Michigan, and so tell us a little bit more about Michigan and all the work that Big Gretch and her crew have been doing there.
Man, the Iowans are going to be so mad about how much I'm talking about Wisconsin and Michigan. Michigan State did nothing good. I'm just going to tell you that right now. No, it's really interesting because, so Wisconsin and Michigan were two states that had very similar governments elected in 2010, which is they elected governments that were a lot more conservative than in the past and did a lot of things that were sort of inconceivable in terms of what they were able to accomplish. For example, repealing rights for unions in Michigan, a place that was more synonymous with the union movement than any other place in the country. The Flint water crisis, for example, was really a breakdown of democracy in terms of how an unappointed city manager could basically change the city's water supply based on greed. And so one of the things I was interested in is the different models there. In Wisconsin, the way that they changed politics was by electing different kind of people. In Michigan, the way they changed politics was by changing the state constitution, because Michigan is one of those states that allows people to have citizen referendums. Does Iowa allow that? No, so that's a problem. I think that's something that every state with limits on it should have. I think in places like California, it's gone crazy where the ballot's 50 pages long. But in places like Michigan, you actually have to build a coalition to get on the ballot, so you actually have to have real support. And what they did is, after Trump won, they started putting initiatives on the ballot to make the political system more fair. So they put an initiative on the ballot to ban partisan gerrymandering and create a citizens commission. It's better than what happens in Iowa, because in Iowa, the commission can be overruled by the politicians. In Michigan, it can't. So they drew fairer lines. And so in 2022, for the first time in a decade, the party that won more votes actually got more seats, a radical concept in a democracy. They also put things on there to make it easier to vote. They passed election day registration, early voting, automatic registration. They protected women's right to choose. They repealed an abortion ban from 1931. They legalized marijuana. And the fascinating thing about all of this is it was all passed with huge bipartisan majorities. I think that is the most important part about this. It was not a Democrat thing. It was a citizen-led thing that had support from many, many, many Republicans. Because if you ask Republicans, a lot of Republicans, should politicians rig the districts to promote their own interests? Should we make it so that there's long lines to vote and your votes are thrown out? Should women be able to make decisions about their own bodies? Should people be thrown in jail for having a little bit of weed? A lot of Republicans want the same thing as Democrats and independents on those issues. And the fascinating thing for me about these ballot initiatives is it was a way to break through the partisan divide, even in a 50-50 state. And so it's not the only model for democracy, because obviously it has to work differently in Iowa and Wisconsin, but I think it shows that the public is not as divided on these issues as you would like to think. And then when things are not in a partisan context, when it's not a D versus R, you can have a lot more meaningful conversations with people about democracy. And I think that is ultimately the way to break through a lot of the clutter, even with the election. So this is something that I've always hear about as a journalist. What do you do when you try to reach the people that believe the election are stolen? And I say nothing. I'm not trying to reach them because I don't think you can change their minds. They are 35% of the country. Is it dangerous that they're 35% of the country? Absolutely, because that means they're 70% of the Republican Party. But I'm much more concerned with the 65% of Americans that don't believe the election was stolen, because I don't believe you can change the minds of the anti-democracy minority in this country, but I think you can mobilize the pro-democracy majority in this country. And so that's what I'm focused on doing. And so I wish we would think more about that, right? More about the majorities that we can mobilize, as opposed to the reactionary minorities that so often we pander to and try to understand, as opposed to understanding they are outnumbered. But we have a political system that in many ways rewards those people that are outnumbered.
Excellent. And then we'll start taking some questions from the crowd. Let's see. And then Bond's coming with the mic.
How do you think the pro-choice, pro-life politics is going to play itself out? And there's been a lot of predictions, but I'm interested in your understanding.
Well, first off, I think that the overturning of Roe v. Wade was a case study for minority rule, because you had a president who was not elected by a majority, a U.S. Senate that did not represent a majority, put 3 Supreme Court justices on the court who were not supported by majorities of people, who then issued a decision that was opposed by a huge majority of Americans. So I think that was an eye-opening thing, because people understood the links between a broken democratic system and broken public policy in a way that I think through Roe v. Wade, a lot of people didn't understand that before, particularly a lot of young people that have been mobilized by these issues. And I think what you've seen is in 7 states, abortion rights have been put on the ballot since Dobbs. And in all 7 states, abortion rights advocates have won. So meaning in both red and blue states. And if you put it on the ballot in Iowa, I guarantee you it would pass, despite the objections of Kim Reynolds and all of the leadership in the state. And it's going to be on the ballot in 10 states now. And I think that is an issue that is going to bring a lot of people to the polls. I think it will pass in almost all of the states, if not all of them. Some states are a little tricky, like Florida, where 60% of people have to be able to oppose it, and the state is going door to door asking people who sign petitions in favor of them if they are who they say they are, which is just like flat out authoritarianism. But I think that that's the kind of thing that I'm saying issue-based organizing can be really galvanizing to people. And also putting out those links between policies, connecting things that people care about to the importance of voting, right? I think a lot more people are going to vote because they understand that rights that they thought were guaranteed weren't actually guaranteed after all.
Oh, right here.
Should we amend the Electoral College or abolish it?
Abolish it. I just put a new video on Instagram about this for anyone who's on Instagram. So, I mean, it was called 3 Reasons Why the Electoral College Sucks, because we wanted some younger people to watch it as well. I mean, I make 3 points. I mean, one is just fundamentally undemocratic. The United States is the only country in which, you can win the popular vote but lose the electoral college, or for that matter, even has an electoral college. Also, no other election in America works like the electoral college. We don't have an electoral college for any other races except for president. So it's antiquated even by American standards. If you look at the 7 states that are going to decide the presidency, they represent 15% of Americans, meaning that 85% of Americans are excluded from counting. I mean, you can argue Iowa, Texas, whatever, but the fact is, it's 7 states that are going to decide the presidency, and people might be 1 or 2 at this point. So that's a problem. It incentivizes election rigging because Trump lost the popular vote by 7 million votes. He would have never been able to overturn 7 million votes in 50 states. But the fact is, he could theoretically challenge 44,000 votes in the 3 closest states. And then it quite literally dates back to slavery. If you look at one of the reasons why the founders didn't want to elect the president. James Madison was the most influential founder at the Constitutional Convention. And he actually gets up and says, I think the people should be able to elect the president. The problem is, I come from a slave state, Virginia, and we have fewer free people than Pennsylvania. So if we have a free election, Virginia will have less power. Therefore, I can't support the Electoral College because of the direct election of the president because of slavery. So basically, there's 2 ways to get rid of it. One way is a constitutional amendment. Funnily enough, we actually almost abolished the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment in the 1960s. It was supported by Nixon and LBJ. It was supported by the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce. It was supported by lots of Democrats, lots of Republicans, but it was killed by Southern segregationists who made a very similar argument to James Madison, that in a free election, black people would have more power because there was a huge block of black voters in the South who were enfranchised as a result of the Voting Rights Act, but they didn't control a majority of Alabama or Louisiana. So therefore, the white majority was like, we don't want these people to count, so we're going to keep the Electoral College. So that almost happened. The other way around it is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And the way that works is that states pledge their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. And when states get to 270 electoral college votes, it goes into effect. This is one of the pieces of legislation that Tim Walz signed in Minnesota. And right now they're at 209 electoral college votes. So they're 61 votes short. And of course, it's going to be challenged before the Supreme Court if it ever got there. But the fact is, they're 61 votes short. So it's unlikely. But it's a lot more likely than a constitutional amendment. So this is the kind of structural reform that I wish people would talk about more. And it was upsetting to me when Tim Walz said the electoral college should be abolished recently. People just said, oh, that's another gaffe. It wasn't a gaffe. Like, he was saying something that 80% of Americans agree with. It's just that he can't say it because it's viewed as too politically risky to make the 7 swing states angry. But he was making a profound, so if we can't even debate the Electoral College in a presidential election year, when are we going to do it? And it's that kind of structural reform that I wish we talked about more because, like my 10-year-old daughter, who some people in this room know, she's a fanatical Knicks fan. and she's fanatical about everything. But she's a fanatical Knicks fan, and she understands if the Knicks get more points, they win the game. Just like when Iowa scores 7 points today, they might win the game 7-3. But the fact is, trying to tell her, like, no, like, Iowa scored 7 and Michigan State scored 3. And not that I'm making a prediction, but Michigan State won the game. I mean, that would be crazy, but that's what we do in American politics. So it just defies basic common sense. What's your prediction? 14-9?
You know what? We might do a little razzle dazzle, get 17.
Okay.
You know,
All right. Don't get too ambitious.
All right. Gentleman right here.
I don't argue with your narrative. I think it's good. But I guess you're associated with Mother Jones. You're probably familiar with the one I'm going to bring up, is the rise of new Democrats in the United States, new labor in Great Britain, and probably misguided socialists on the continent of Europe, who exposed their, forgot their connections to labor unions, who exposed their workers to free trade, mobile finance capital, exporting jobs, China, rise of Deng Xiaoping in China to take advantage of that. So that we have, I fought most of my life against these Democrats who forgot the domestic policy of the LBJ, that, brought all the good things that I enjoy as an old person now.
Yeah.
And as a working person. But, when Reagan, worked on stripping the unions, Bill Clinton claimed, these Democrats came in and just, well, we're new Democrats now. Let's expose ourselves to, the world. I mean, that's good to some extent to the rest of the world, but it wasn't good for, the labor and workers in the United States or Great Britain.
That's a really, really good point. And I think it explains a lot of Trump's appeal. If you look at the places where Trump is doing well, it's people that have been displaced by industrialization, where jobs have left, not just, exactly, those are the strongholds in France, and if you look at where labor until recently was suffering in England, same kind of places, Northern England, and I mean, you can make a very legitimate argument that the Democratic Party abandoned these people and that they were culpable in this with NAFTA and other things. And I just watched an incredible documentary on PBS that Bill Moyers did about Wisconsin, where he goes to these communities in Milwaukee. And it's fascinating because it's about both the white and black working class. And the black working class is always missing from these stories. And he looks at them over a period of 20 to 30 years. He keeps going back to Milwaukee. And first off, the black family and the white family are going through a lot of the same things. So they're often pitted against each other, but they have a lot of shared interests. And then secondly, you see that the Democratic Party decided, in many cases, to side with Wall Street. And they cheered things like NAFTA and sending jobs overseas. And they viewed the outsourcing jobs as inevitable. And in some cases, accelerated it, as opposed to fighting for those jobs and to fight and create a more just economy. And that created a void in which a lot of populists have filled that void. And I don't think that anybody believes that Trump is actually going to fight for those people, but they actually hear him saying things that they agree with, which is, we are going to get tough on China. We are going to bring jobs back. And you look at, for example, the Democrats that are still doing well. How is it possible that in Ohio, for example, which has elected Republicans at all levels of the ticket, Sherrod Brown is going to win his Senate race? And everyone, like John Tesser's endangered in Montana, but Sherrod Brown's going to win in Ohio because he has stayed true to those constituents. And he has talked to those constituents. And he has said to them, we might disagree on things. We might disagree on abortion. We might disagree on guns. But he can go into those union halls and talk to them. And not talk down to them, but to talk with them. And I think Tim Walz can do that too. But too many people in the Democratic Party have sided with big business over Main Street. And they share culpability with this. Same thing in Iowa. So many Democrats in Iowa sided with Monsanto and sided with agribusiness and didn't fight for small farmers. And that has created a void in which a lot of misinformation and disinformation has seeped in. So I think a lot of it does go back. I mean, listen, we could create the best, most democratic political system in the country, but if people don't feel like they have a meaning to their lives, and a lot of people get meaning to their lives through work, it's going to create the kind of conditions for this kind of right-wing populism to be able to flourish. Okay, I'm going to give shorter answers.
All right. Let's go right here first, and then we'll go to the gentleman back there.
It's my former principal. He's going to have some tough kind of questions for me.
No, not tough enough.
Ari, you said earlier about the far right building a fortress to stop the coming siege.
Yeah.
That we anticipate white minority in the future, and my point is a kind of double-sided question. It seems like when you look at the major issues now, climate change, diversity, women's rights, environmental protection, gun control, all that the younger generation is on the other side.
Yeah, they are.
And so are we waiting until a time when they're kind of ceding to that in 20 years? Or that's one thing, is that an accurate perception of younger, political views? And secondly, is there anything to do to accelerate it? You mentioned earlier, something sucks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, yes, but they have to vote, and they have to vote in the same numbers as older people to have their concerns taken seriously. And again, this is another thing where a lot of young people feel like their voices haven't been heard. You look at, for example, the war in Gaza, and I'm not taking a position on this, but a lot of young people don't feel like either party is taking their concerns seriously on these issues, that there's basically a bipartisan consensus that's reflectively pro-Israel in this country, and therefore it's shades as opposed to anyone really breaking with that kind of consensus. And so that's a thing that a lot of people, not everyone, but that's something that a lot of people care about, that they don't feel like their political leaders are addressing. But yes, I mean, I do think they're moving in a more progressive direction. I do think that some of these demographic changes are inevitable, but I also think there's cautionary tales out there like Texas. Texas is already a majority-minority state. It is already a state where, based on the demographics, it should be a competitive state. But because it's so hard to vote, because it's so gerrymandered, that the demographics and the politics don't line up. And that's what I'm concerned about as a model, potential model for the country. So yes, it's very possible that progress is inevitable and progress will happen. But the question is, how long can you forestall that progress? And how far can you kick it down the road? And how cynical can you make people be about the potential for there being some kind of change? And again, I think it goes back to giving people something to vote for, and telling people that the top of the ticket is not the only thing that matters. If you want to solve a lot of these issues, the president can only do so much, and even the federal government can only do so much. And so a lot of things matter at the state level too, and I think that's one of the things that I'm really trying to get people to understand in this election, that like, okay, fine, you don't have the power necessarily to determine what the president can do, but I bet you can find 7 votes to try to swing a U.S. House district to decide who the next Speaker of the House is going to be.
Okay, there's that gentleman right there with the amazing mustache. You gotta look.
Thank you.
Good beard too.
Yeah.
And Ari, Fairfield's proud of you. So I've been thinking about generation ago and how Ford was like head of the Nazi thing.
Yeah.
What's going on with Elon? Is he?
Yeah.
What?
No, he is. No, I mean it's true.
Say
I
no
mean,
more.
he is the it is like Henry Ford. I mean, who but possibly worse in terms of his influence. I think it's really dangerous. I think the people were much too utopian about the democratization of the media. It has not been good for democracy to get rid of all the gatekeepers. And I think that we need to figure out something to do about this, consistent with the First Amendment. But I think you could argue that things he are doing goes beyond protected speech, particularly when it gets so involved in the political process. We have things, even with all the deregulation, we have laws in terms of what you can do politically. And I think he is pushing the boundaries. A lot of stuff. I was in England in August, and I was there right after the riots broke out, where there was that tragic stabbing of kids at a Taylor Swift listening party. But then there was a lot of insane anti-Muslim violence, even though it had nothing to do with that. And a lot of it was through X that it was done. And people in England, and granted they have different laws, but they were talking seriously about prosecuting Elon Musk. And it was a very, very different conversation over there in a country that's not that different in terms of America, in terms of its politics. And so I think that this is something that we're really going to have to talk about. And I think he's really pushing the boundaries of legality with a lot of the things that he's doing. He also has government contracts. There's rules for people that have government contracts. So I personally think the Justice Department should be taking a very, very, very hard look at his actions, not because they want to prosecute him because he supports Trump, but because I think a lot of the things he's doing right now are illegal under both corruption, conflict of interest, and also political laws. My hope is that his political operation is as shitty as his social media platform. I think there's some indication that it is. And I think the product he's selling is a lot crappier than Tesla. So I think I'm like not necessarily sold that he's like some evil genius when it comes to politics, but certainly in terms of letting disinformation. I mean, in 2020, Trump's lies about mail voting were flagged on X and deleted in lots of cases. And now the biggest purveyor of disinformation runs that place. So it's having a profoundly negative effect on democracy. And the problem is that plus Fox News is basically replacing local media. And I mean, I'm sure you guys saw the documentary about Storm Lake and Art Cullen. And I mean, you know, he won a Pulitzer, I think?
Yeah.
He won a Pulitzer. But what this guy had to do just to put out a paper, I mean, the structural forces that he was up against. I mean, so we have to also understand that a free press is a vital part of a democracy. And that is also something that's been really chipped away at in places like Iowa and has allowed a lot of hateful disinformation to replace it.
All right, we got time for, looks like one more?
I'll do two more.
Oh, two more?
quickly.
Okay.
All right, hold on, where are we going?
Let's go to this young lady.
Maybe we should
with the
move
Iowa-
on.
They're
even though-
incredibly
even with the
quick.
Iowa State on.
Very quickly. Yeah. That's the Iowa State person gets asked half a question.
Okay, because I was going to try and ask two, so I'll do the more important one. You mentioned some things we could do about federal judges.
Yeah.
Because I still harbor some frustration with Barack Obama that he didn't do more to fill some of those seats
Yeah.
when he was, his
Yeah.
first 2 years. So what could we do?
Well, I mean, first off, the Congress has the power to change the different things about the Supreme Court, including the number of judges. There's no reason it has to be 9. So I think you could argue that all 3 of Trump judges were appointed illegitimately for different reasons. I think that the Democrats are control the Senate Judiciary Committee right now. They control the power of the purse. They control the court's funding, and they could be more aggressive there. They could call hearings and bring these people before the Senate. If they don't, they could televise them with other experts talking about the court. This is a thing of failure to mobilize people and a failure to use the bully pulpit. I went to a Harris rally recently. She talked about the Supreme Court, but she mentioned it once. And to me, that how in the wake of Dobbs do you not talk more about the single institution that unleashed all of this? Okay, quickly, I'll do two questions quickly. Yeah.
Hold on one moment, please, sir.
In terms of oligarchy and Citizens United,
Yeah.
what would be the quickest fix?
Well, I mean, the quickest fix would be legislation. The long-term fix would be a constitutional amendment basically saying that money does not equal speech, which I think most Americans would intuitively understand. The more money in the system, the more corruption in the system. The Supreme Court did not say that, but I think that's kind of just at odds with common sense. Was there one more back there?
If we have one more quick one, or did you have one? Okay, was there a part that wasn't answered?
Just whether you thought there should be reforms to the Supreme Court.
Yes, I mean, and just to understand, like, some of these reforms take a while, and so you have to start shifting public consciousness, to use a word that people in Fairfield will be familiar with, and the fact that Joe Biden, who was the ultimate institutionalist, came out for Supreme Court reform. That starts to change the conversation. A lot of people, the coverage in the media was like, oh, it's just like a lame duck step. Like, no, like, this is about the battle that comes next. This is about the fact that if Harris wins, she has to make it an issue because Biden put it on the table. So people have to start talking about it and changing. Politics, they always say, is the art of the possible, right? Change what is possible. And I think the Supreme Court is one of those things because, I mean, you can have all the best intentioned people in the world, but if 5 justices don't agree with it, they have the final say on so many things. And so they have not just given the president the power of the king, they have themselves acted like kings and in some cases queens. And I think that is one of the major reforms that we're going to have to start pushing for in the coming years.
All right, well, unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time here. Please help me thank Ari Berman
Thanks so much.
and Ty Rushing.
Thank you.